building, so I'm glad that we were able to still get a good turnout today. My name is Ryan McCarthy. I'm filling in. I'm Mary's Science and Technology Policy Advisor, and I'm filling in for Chairman Nichols, who is unable to be here today, unfortunately. She sends her regrets, but she got called back out to D.C. on short notice. So I'm filling in for her today in what is the first of the chair's, I guess, the inaugural lecture in the chair's seminar series. And we're hoping that this will, become a regular thing with very interesting talks. And I know we'll kick it off with a very strong talk today. And we have a very distinguished speaker in Jane Long, as well as a great panel of researchers who are going to, I think, lead to some very lively, interesting conversation. The Chairman Series was designed to present events and programs to specially invited guests, including our esteemed guest today, on very topical environmental and energy policy issues involving air pollution and global climate change. I'm going to just give some housekeeping bullets, and then I will turn the mic over to Commissioner Boyd to introduce our speaker more appropriately. But we do always want to make sure that we're well prepared in the unlikely event of any unforeseen circumstances. So I'll just point out the exits. There's a lot. It's a small room. I think you'll figure out how to get out. But if we do need to evacuate the building in the event of a fire alarm, staff will help you out. And we go to the nearest exit. You'll find some stairs, and there's a relocation site across the street, and we'll direct you there. There's a drinking fountain if you guys need to use the restroom or get a drink. You go out the doors here, turn left, bathrooms and drinking fountains are there. For anybody on the webcast, the webcast is up? For anybody on the webcast, all right, oh yeah, there's a, all right, well, pardon the top of my head. We encourage you to send any email or questions, and you can send that to sierrarm@calepa.ca.gov. That's SIERRARM@calepa.ca.gov. With that, I will turn it over to Commissioner Boyd. He is the Vice Chair of the California Energy Commission. He has a very, very long, distinguished career in state service, and I believe he only has one more year of that career. But he's been engaged in many of these issues for a very long time. He's been a great service to the state, and I think he will have some very valuable perspective on a lot of these issues. So,
well, thank you. It's 6 months, and I'm counting. But it seems like the beginning of this year, I said, my God, just a year to go. And it's already 6 months. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm pleased to see a robust audience for this topic. And it will be my job to introduce my dear friend. I don't say old friend anymore, Jane. I say people I've known for a long, long time, and what have you. But let me make a few remarks as to why perhaps the Energy Commission standing here in the Cal EPA building at a ARB lecture series. Energy, air quality, then global climate change have been joined at the hip, or there's a strong nexus, has been there all my working life, which a few weeks ago hit 50 years as an employee of the state of California, so no wonder I'm going to retire, huh? Couldn't get a real job, so I just stayed and stayed and stayed. But in any event, we've all worked together on these topics for very long periods of time, and many of us who've been very intimate with the topics have recognized that strong bond relationship nexus, call it what you want. And of course, the ARB and CEC, when I was in either place, worked very closely on the air quality energy nexus for decades. Along came global climate change, which many of us knew about, but it finally became topical. And part of the policy of the state of California, and that nexus was just reinforced. AB 32, ultimately the ARB scoping plan, which quite frankly, if you look closely at it, has heavy early reliance on energy stuff and things that California's been doing at the CEC, the PUC, other energy agencies, and of course now the ARB becomes an energy agency. But in any event, very heavy reliance on energy-related things, and that's fairly obvious to some of us because the production and use of energy, you know, first was our air quality dilemma, and then, oh my gosh, it's really the root cause of most of the world's problems with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and what have you. So there was great logic for the CEC to be a sponsor, let's just say, a monetary sponsor of the work that the CCST ultimately was asked to do with regard to scientific views with regard to our greenhouse gas program in California, which means you talk about our energy program and a lot of other things. The nexus gave rise to, as I said, us putting up $50,000 from our peer program for this activity. Now I'm going to give a commercial for the peer program, which is under tremendous assault right now in the legislature, which legislature is angry about everything. So the public goods charge in California sunsets this year and needs to be reauthorized in the eyes of many of us, and the research program is a component thereof. So many of us are out giving commercials like I'm doing now for continued support for the peer program. I'm fairly confident there will be a peer program. I'm not as confident about the rest of the public goods charge program, but enough said. This is not about that. You all know that California faces long-term challenges and thus opportunities with respect to greenhouse gas emission goals. The 2050 goals are very ambitious, and quite frankly, it's very hard for the state of California to look that far into the future. I know from the 20 years I spent at the ARB and the almost 10 now at the Energy Commission, we've shuddered to think about that far into the future, and some of my peers in the past have refused to let us even think that far into the future as we've done our Integrated Energy Policy Report. But quite frankly, in this day and age, we need far greater and more thorough understandings of what energy technologies will be needed to achieve these goals. And many of us for the past few years have on a seemingly daily basis been talking about today, tomorrow, and 2050. To meet the projected electricity growth for California, to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, a variety of electricity generation options were considered by the CCST in doing their work, and I'm going to let them talk about it. They've touched upon the whole subject area, areas that Jane and I and others in this room know are going to be controversial, and I almost don't like to say the word nuclear and indicate it's controversial, but it will be. As the state's liaison to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for almost 10 years, I've learned more about the subject than I frankly wanted to, and just know that that it's a touchy issue to deal with. On the other hand, something near and dear to my heart, biomass, bioenergy, is also touched upon, and that's something I was pleased to hear about, see about, and we will talk about more. Because in my remaining 6 months, I intend to push that about as far as you politically can as something we need to address. Studies that take a longer view are important to all of us for all the reasons I just said. They will help guide us, you, others, for quite a long period into the future to design our energy future, to help us design energy research portfolios for the future. And so when our scientific community makes a contribution like they have in this report, it's something many of us want to pay attention to, work with folks, and include in our let's just say, portfolio of plans for California's future. And I would just mention, this is not the only study. There are other studies going on that fortunately the peer program has managed to fund before it came under scrutiny and question. We've got an ongoing project going in the Lawrence Berkeley lab now, which will end in about 3 months. We're going to want to coordinate that output with what we are hearing from this report. It's been informally coordinated, of course, because Jane comes to us from Lawrence Livermore, and there's a close association. There's been follow-up projects with Dan Kamen at UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley that Jane has been involved in, so this is not the only game in town. These are all types of tools that we in the policy world have to take into account as we, people like Mary and I and my peers and her peers on the air board have to take into account as we recommend where we should be going. So in any event, that's a lengthy commentary, but it's to me necessary to point out these are all tools, and there are lots of tools that we have to take into consideration. It's never black and white, it's always gray, and thus policy people have to deal with that question. For that reason, we at the CEC are happy to be part of this effort and appreciate the output. And so I want to say thank you to the ARB for their dominant role here. Thank you to the CCST in general, an organization I've been very familiar with for quite a long time. And thank you to Jane, whom I've known for a number of years. I won't even try to come close for how many. But we've worked together a lot, and I have appreciated her involvement in this project, and have appreciated the professional and personal relationship we've had for quite a long time. So Jane, with that, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you.
So Jim, how did you do 50 years of service when you're only 40 years old? That math doesn't work either. Thank you so much for that, really gracious. Oh, I don't need to use this. Okay, can you hear me? Right. Good. Thanks very much for that gracious introduction, Jim. This has been one of the great pleasures of my career to work on this study, working with people like Jim and Mary Nichols in the state and some of the other people that have been involved and supportive of us in doing this, and the wonderful committee that we had that I'll introduce to you in just a minute. The context for our study is a little different. We had first planned to do a study that was based on the National Academy doing a study called America's Energy Future, and we were going to Californicate that report and make California's energy future. But we began to realize that with the executive order in place for 2050, we were in a unique position to start to look a little bit farther ahead at what it would actually take to get an 80% reduction. And with that unique cap that the National Academy of Sciences didn't have, we were able to try to understand whether the technology was there, whether we really could do this. Were there energy systems that would meet these very extreme goals of 80% reductions? So the goal is to bring 480 million metric tons a year down to something like 80. This is a very dramatic decrease now in less than 40 years. So let's see what we can do. And we decided that we would take an approach to this which was an existence proof. Would we be able to find the technology to do this? Is there technology out there? Could you conceive of a system that would do it? And the idea here is really to find a system that meets your needs. So we looked at population growth, we looked at economic growth, projected what our needs would be based on that, and then asked, could we still meet those needs and eliminate the emissions? This is the committee, and I'd like to just spend a minute. On the left, you see our lead authors, and every single one of them except Max are here today. So I'd just like you to raise your hands. Jeff Greenblatt, here in the audience, did all of our spreadsheet analysis. If you look on the website and you want to see where our numbers are, the spreadsheet is now there, and hopefully soon will be a little bit more user-friendly, but you can see it the way Jeff worked with it now, and you can see that just the entire energy system represented there in that spreadsheet. And you can, if you don't like the numbers we came up with, you can start to play and put your numbers in. And then we also have here Bert Richter in the upper first row, who's ran the nuclear power report. Also look on the CCST website. We just earlier in the week released a sub-report on the nuclear power system, we will have a series of sub-reports coming out. The report that came out a few weeks ago is the summary report. And we have Heather Youngs here, who is getting out a report on biofuel. Max is not here. He'll be doing an efficiency report. Chris Yang here doing transportation. And that report is in draft form. I just saw it this morning. He got it down to 40 pages, so we're on our way. And Brian Hannigan will be doing renewables. And then I'd like to introduce my co-chair, who's just been a wonderful support and help to us all, Mim John. And also in the audience here today, we have Nate Lewis, who will be joining us at the podium, who was part of the spirit of the zeitgeist of this report. Jan Shorey is here, worked on the nuclear power part. Bob Epstein here today. Joan Ogden in the back on transportation. And I think that's it, right? Oh, Margaret Taylor is here, and Carl Weinberg. And they were, who else? John Wyant. Oh, John Wyant, right, over there. Okay, and John Wyant is here. Did I miss anybody else who's here today? So as we go through and you ask questions, I probably just point to those guys to answer them. So the short answer to the question, can we do it? Yes, we can. But we were very careful about the way we did this analysis to try to assess our ability to make these energy systems with technology we knew about first, and then to say what more would be required. So the short answer is, with technology we know about that's pretty much on the shelf, you can go out and buy it, or it's been demonstrated, then you can get to about 60% emission cuts. And this is looking at a bottom-up study that I'll be describing in a minute. But if we try to go the rest of the way to the full 80%, it's going to require a lot more technical innovation. So it's the normal rule that the last part of the problem requires a lot more effort than the first part. So we did identify, I think, two major real technology holes that I'll just give you a little preview of right now. We don't think that the load balancing problem has the technology that we need. If we're going to have a lot of demand response and ability to handle a lot of intermittent resources, and even the resources that are base load, where you have to add peaking power, if we're going to have to squeeze emissions out of every part of the system, we don't feel that the technology to do that is there today. The other place where we saw a major hole is a potential for an insufficient amount of technology or insufficient support, technical approaches off the shelf or in demonstration today on the fuel problem. We have a wonderful resource in biofuels, and if we develop that, we'll get a lot of the way there. We might even get all the way there, but we think that the sort of mean guess of where we are right now is that we probably need more technology in those areas. So those two areas were the big holes in technology. So how did we do the work? We simplified the process. And I really think that this chart is the most important thing that you can see in the whole presentation today, because this was a group of people from all different parts of the energy system who had to grapple with each other about sharing the way that they approached the problem in a way that kept everybody honest and didn't double count and didn't leave holes. And this chart really summarizes what that is. So what we said is, let's first figure out how we could do the same amount of work without using as much energy. So we make things as efficient as possible, and then that would decrease the amount of fuel and the amount of electricity that you need. Simple step. And then the next step is to say, well, we also think it's a lot easier to decarbonize electricity than it is mobile sources, so let's electrify as much as we can. And that's more than just plug-in cars. That's going to be heat and heavy-duty, some bus and rail transport, et cetera. We're not going to be able to electrify airplanes yet, or ships, but we need to be able to electrify everything that we possibly can. So then we readjust the demand based on those two things. We've accounted for population growth, accounted for economic growth, and we readjust the demand. And then we have a fairly two simple questions. We know how much electricity we need. We want to produce it without carbon, so we have a number of ways we can do that, and we examine how that can be done. Do we use nuclear power, CCS, renewables? And you have to account for the emissions from load balancing. So And then we say, well, how much fuel do we still need? And when we have that amount of fuel, we try to first provide it from biofuels, which is the one thing that's in the pipeline right now, and hydrogen, which is also a possibility. So in doing these 4 steps, if you want to look at it graphically, this little graphic explains it. We need fuel and electricity to power to supply energy. We use those as energy carriers. And each of them have a greenhouse gas intensity. If we make it more efficient, we're essentially using less of those. And so the area, which is the greenhouse gas footprint, shrinks. And then we shift it towards electricity, squeeze it down so that we have more greener sources of power, greener sources of fuel. And in the end, we try to get to the target. These simple 4 steps. This sounds really simple, but think about some of the things that the state is doing right now that are not like this. And I want to give you one example, and I won't dwell on it because we'll be part of Q&A later. The state has a metric for zero net energy buildings, for example. They are convolving in that the use of renewable energy on the roof with making the building more efficient. So if it's zero net energy, you don't know how much it's being efficient and how much you're supplying supposedly solar power on the roof. And then the whole electricity system, which has to deal with reliability and which has to deal with intermittent resources, is affected in some unknown way. This methodology doesn't do that. This methodology counts each thing in its order in a very separate way. And so when you get to electricity, Brian has to tell us how to solve the whole problem, including those resources on the roof. So I think that these 4 steps took us well over a year to develop in negotiating with each other, and it's a very important result of the thing, because I don't think the actual numbers that we're going to show you today are numbers that will last for very long. They are our best estimates now. But the methodology, I think, is robust and is really important. We invoked technology in these 4 tests. We classified the technology, as I mentioned before. We mostly only looked at bin 1 and bin 2 technology. So bin 1 is technology that's deployed now. Bin 2 is technology that's been demonstrated. We know about these technologies. In a couple of cases, for various reasons, which I'll tell you in a minute, we did dip into bin 3 for one of 2 reasons. Either we thought it was actually going to happen by 2050. We had good reason to believe that. Or we really had no information, and we had to make a wild guess at what was going to happen. So we did that in one case, which you'll see. We never invoked anything in bin 4 to get to a realistic estimate of how much emissions could be cut. Okay, we did start to look into bin 3 and bin 4 for the 60% to 80% cut. So we started a bottom-up study. We looked at 3 sectors for efficiency. Max White did a lot of this work. Jeff Greenblatt here, Jim McMahon. We looked at buildings, industry, and transportation separately and built up how fast the rollover rates could happen. So I'm just going to show you 2 quick examples. More questions on this. Jeff and Chris are here and can answer them. These are just some data on building efficiency. And you can see on the upper right, for example, the blue triangle is all the buildings that we have right now. They're extant right now. And you can see that by 2050, in order to meet this standard, none of those buildings are untouched. They are either retrofit or they're torn down. And so all the buildings in 2050 have been built new to new standards, or they've been retrofit to new standards. And when you do that, you can improve the efficiency by something like 80% on new buildings and about 60% on retrofit buildings. So this cumulative energy use decrease is a clear metric of what's happening. This is not convolved with putting solar on the roof. Okay, this is just how much less energy we use in buildings. Similarly, Chris did this work on light-duty vehicles. He also has graphs like this. He has multiple graphs like this for different assumptions and different sectors in the transportation. I'll just show you this one. And you can see the blue, again, is the cars we have on the road right now. And as we roll over to various forms of electricity, using electricity, we find that in the 2050 timeframe, we've gone from an average fleet efficiency of something like, I think he's got 25 miles per gallon up to an average fleet efficiency of over 70 by rolling in PEVs, PHEVs, and hybrids, and conventional cars, et cetera, and replacing conventional cars. So these are bottom-up studies that were based on historical understanding of what rollover rates could be. And these are what we call a realistic estimate of the future. So when we do that, we end up reducing the amount of electricity we need by 31% and reducing the amount of fuel that we need by about half. So you've made everything more efficient doing that. Notice that bus and rail doesn't get anything here, but in the next shot, we do electrification, and you see bus and rail have to be 100% electrified. And now, because we've electrified everything, we've lost all the gains we made in electricity. We basically are back where we were before. You have to produce about twice as much electricity as we use today by 2050. But we've been able to cut the amount of fuel, which is the real problem, by 33%. So basically, well, I have to stick here. The net result of both efficiency and electrification is that we're going to have to produce an electricity system which is twice as big as the one we have now and produces essentially no emissions. And we still have to find almost as much fuel as we use today in 2050 if we're going to account for population growth and economic growth. And I should make a comment here that we used very moderate numbers, and we only used one. We only used one estimate of population growth, only one estimate of the economy. So there's definitely room here to look at ranges. These plots I'm going to go through very quickly. They are just bin charts of the technology we invoked, and I'm just highlighting here in yellow the bin 1 and 2. These were the technologies we invoked to do this. You can see building efficiency, the technology we need to do this is known, and that's the point. The industry technology here was one of the places we dipped into the bin 3 because we thought it would be in the economic interest of industry to do them, and so we felt that that was a reasonable estimate to use them by 2050. And again, in the automobile sector, the technology we needed to do these changes is there. So again, just to summarize the case, electricity in 2005 was about 270 terawatt hours per year. We're going to have to more or less double that, the E1 case. The BAU case, if we did nothing, was more or less the same to first order. We're more or less doubling the amount of electricity that we need in 2050. And again, by fuels, we're almost as much. So now the next question, this is step 3. We just did step 1 and step 2. Step 3 is how do we produce that electricity without producing emissions? Well, we have 3 choices that we know about. Nuclear power, which doesn't produce emissions. It's baseload power. We assumed in every case here that the 33% renewables would be extant in 2050, because that's the law. So we always accounted for at least 33% renewables. So we said, well, if we don't do, we have 3 choices for the rest of it. We could do it with nuclear power. We could do it with fossil fuel generation and carbon capture and storage. Or we could do all renewables. And we looked at those 3 cases and we compared them. So one of the first things to say is that if you do it all with renewables, the capacity factors are so low that you need to have about 3 times as many plants, 3 times as much capacity to deal with the intermittency. Fossil, you require a little bit more as well because there's a parasitic load for sequestering the carbon dioxide. But to first order, the amount of nuclear power or fossil plants with CCS you would need are about the same. And the amount of renewable energy that you would need if you did it that way is 3 times as much. So to first order, that's one of the big impacts of the choice. So nuclear we had, as I mentioned, a nuclear report coming out. I won't go through this slide in any great detail except to say that we would probably need to build about 1.4 gigawatts per year, which is within historical precedent, but certainly a major impact. If we were going to have 2/3 of our electricity come from nuclear power, we'd have to get going. And this is starting in about 2020, which is probably the soonest you could possibly start. Certainly challenges from nuclear power and the impact of what's going to happen from Fukushima and what it means. I think the task force for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission just this week reported out saying basically that power plants are now going to have to design safety measures for multiple simultaneous accidents. So whereas in Japan, the problem was you had an earthquake and a tsunami at the same time, similar thoughts are going to go to nuclear power plants in the United States. And how that's all going to play out still remains to be seen. One thought that one of our committee members had that I thought was very interesting about how the future of nuclear power might unwind was that this Fukushima accident could actually stop production of the old Gen 2 reactors and really that are not passively safe. And basically, the silver lining of this is that if we go forward with the nuclear power, we'd be going forward with technology that was inherently safer and better technology. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. But no one knows how this is going to shake out, and it's certainly going to be a very interesting and long process. The issue with coal and natural gas for California will be the sequestration. We know how to build these kind of thermal plants, but the actual separation, which is the most costly part of the process, the separation of the CO2 from the flue gas, and then putting it underground, and the integration of that, the pipelines required, or the transmission required because you've decided that you have to put the power plant near where the sequestration is. All of those choices will be difficult. But the main key two elements from our perspective are, one, we can only capture about 90% of emissions effectively because it's very expensive to go beyond that. You can theoretically capture all of it, but capturing the next 90% of the last 10% costs as much as the first 90%. So the diminishing returns on costs are very steep at the end. So the committee expert opinion was 90% was really the effective number. And secondly, that we have to find places to put it. We have a lot of old oil and gas reservoirs. They could probably last us through this decades through this century. But if we kept up with this kind of technology, we would be looking at going into saline aquifers. And the problem with that is that we don't really know very much about them. Oil and gas reservoirs people characterized because they were getting oil and gas out of them, but we haven't really looked at the saline aquifers as much. That's not to say they wouldn't be good, but it would take a lot more work. Renewable energy, the major point to make here, we've already made the point about capacity, but the state has a lot of renewable energy, and we could certainly, in terms of the possible potential of renewable energy, it's there. We could do it all with renewable energy in terms of its capacity. The issue, so here are some data about the build rates of these things for each of these cases. I won't go through it too much, except I mentioned about 1.4 gigawatts per year, or this says 1.5. For nuclear, it's about the same for fossil, and it would have to be more aggressive for renewables just because the capacity factor is lower. Now, the issue with renewables and all of the energy sources is going to be load balancing. And one of our recommendations is that the state begin to look at load balancing as an energy sector and really treat it as something that has emissions and technology requirements and management requirements in a very coherent way. So we have three ways to manage this. We can use natural gas. So if you look at what's happening in the state today, people are looking at the portfolio standard coming in, and immediately the natural gas companies are coming in and saying, "Oh, good, we're going to have to firm this power with natural gas." It's the way we know how to do it. It's the least expensive way to do it, and it produces emissions. So a lot of the benefit of using renewable energy, if it's highly intermittent, is lost by firming the power with natural gas. If we don't do that, we can have energy storage. Well, the quality of the energy storage that we require if we use a very highly intermittent resource is very different than if we have a lot of base load. We didn't go into this in detail. We think this is a really important study to follow up on, because basically, if you have weeks at a time when the wind doesn't blow and when the sun is, I know my house, the sun hasn't shone in a week, in the last week. Of course, the week before that it was brutally hot, but I might have wanted electricity this week and last week. Those kind of large-scale storage projects, we found that the technology was just not there. And so that's a big technology load. The final solution is to say, well, okay, well, if we don't have as much electricity when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, let's get people to make choices that not to use electricity then, or to adjust their loads and to try to also balance sources from a variety of, say, wind plants around the state that might be, one is producing when another one isn't. And all of that flexible load balancing problem is, first of all, the technology to manage the system is not there. The technology to, if you just look at what happened in the state with the smart meter implementation, and Susan can show her wounds, as CCST just did a study for the state on smart meters. Brian was involved in that as well. It was just very, very difficult for people to accept even the smallest change to smart meters. So I think that the change that we need to make is much larger. It's going to be much more akin to changing from Ma Bell to the kind of cell phone service that we have now, probably to a power of 10. Some people have said, I've heard it quoted, that the network for this system, should we go all renewable, is bigger than the World Wide Web. So I don't, it could be apocryphal, but I think it's not well understood. If you're buying renewable energy as the source, as the solution for the state, you need to buy this part of the solution too. And that has to be the message that we bring here. Just to give you a feeling for the magnitude of this, these graphs, the dark blue is the emissions. If we balance the load for each of these three solutions we looked at with natural gas, and the light blue is if we somehow figure out the load balancing problem without emissions. And you can see for the renewable energy case, first, this just shows that the magnitude of the emissions we would get from just balancing the load with 100% renewables, with about a 70% of that portfolio being intermittent resources, exceeds or is actually on the same order of magnitude as the entire target for the entire energy economy. So if we don't solve the intermittency problem and you balance the load with natural gas, you're not going to make the target. There's no way you can make the target if you don't solve this problem. Now, there's another sleeper in there. It's not only solving the problem. Those dark blue bars for those three choices are actually very different in quality. And this graph doesn't show that, because the quality of the intermittency that you have to solve in renewable energy is quite different than ramping or peak load that you have if you have base load. So the question really is, how are you going to solve this? So I think I said all this, so I'm not going to dwell on this. So I think that the major question that you're going to have here is, are we going to have base load? If you're going to have base load in the system, then your question is, how much do you need and where are you going to get it from? And then to the extent that you're not going to have base load, how can you get this commitment to solving the intermittency problem? The commitment to restructuring the utility, commitment to research to solve the energy storage problem, and the alternative is you're not going to have a reliable system, which I think is pretty unacceptable to most people in the state, and not a very good idea for the economy. I'll just take an aside here. It's not in my presentation, but I want to make a point about the economy. We get asked a lot about the effect of the economy, of the changes that we're talking about here. One of the things that keeps being brought up is green jobs. Personally, I don't think green jobs are going to be the major effect of the economy. But having a reliable electricity system and energy system in the state is vital for our economy. And so the sense of that base economy, which relies on energy, is really, really important. And so getting this right is more important for the economy and must be compared to what will happen if we do nothing. Because if we do nothing, the price of fossil fuel is also going to go up. And if this price, so the way in which we think about the economic impact of that needs to be a lot more than green jobs. It needs to include whether or not we have a reliable source of energy that has got a base, a price that is not going up and down, a non-volatile price that's competitive. Again, I'm just going to show you these same graphs for nuclear and CCS, and you can see that the yellow bands are there, that we have the technology in place. Renewable energy, we know about these technologies. But the load balancing is a different story. And here, what we did moving forward, just so we could look at the fuel problem in some reasonable way, is we made a WAG at what could be available in 2050. And just basically said that about half the load balancing would be handled without emissions, half of it would be handled with emissions, and we assumed that the state would adopt a mixed portfolio of electricity, which we thought would probably be the most robust and safe case for the state, to have some nuclear power, some CCS, and some renewable energy. We then started to look at the fuel. So recall, we still needed about 27 billion gallons, billion gallons of gasoline equivalent, I can never get that out, per year of fuel. And that's the part of the fuel that you can't sequester. So for example, we still were using some fuel in our electricity system, but we were using CCS and capturing it. So I'm not counting that part. We need this fuel because we can't electrify everything, and because we have to load follow. Half of our load following was with gas, so we still need the fuel for that. And the only technology that we really thought was in the pipeline for that is biofuels. We did, at a later point, the only technology we think is in the bin 1, bin 2 pipeline was biofuels. We included hydrogen in the next step. So I'm sorry, I have a double slide in there. So California is blessed with a lot of biomass that's possible, and a lot of it's from waste. And Heather did this analysis where she looked at the state's estimates for how much would be available, and she was able to show that quite a bit more was available than what the previous estimates had. And the purpose of this graph that she put together is to show that there are a lot of sources. All of them except the top one are waste. The top one are crops that are grown without water or fertilizer and grown on marginal lands. So all of these are sources that would have no, if you restricted them to these sources, they would have no other externalities like impact on food. And that all of these can be used in some process or another to produce either electricity, gaseous fuel, or liquid fuel. So one of the choices the state is going to face is how to best allocate the resources we have. And she can tell you more about that. The second is that she was able to estimate the amount, the total amount. And so we think there's a pretty broad range. It could be between 3 and 10 billion gallons of gasoline equivalent of coming out of this biomass. But probably about 3 of that, 2 of that, yielding 3 gigawatts, should best be used for electricity because of its location and its type. It wouldn't make much sense to turn it into fuel. So we have only about 5.5 in a median estimate of what might be produced in 2050, 5.5 billion gallons of gasoline a year of biofuel. Remember, our total amount we're looking for is 27. So we think we could import some. One of the rules of our study was that you were not allowed to take more than your fair share of resources. So if the entire country was producing biomass, we're about 10% of the country, we could invoke about 10%. A lot of this could be coming from Brazil, and that might be part of the import too. But we just estimated essentially, if you look back here, well, I didn't have it, but that we would import more or less about the same, well, you can see it here, 2 plus 5.5 is 7.5. So the amount we produce in the state, we just assumed that as a median estimate that we might be able to import about the same amount. So that gives us 13, but the total demand was for that could not be sequestered was 27. So it's more or less only half. Our median estimate of what you can get out of the biomass is only about half. Now the fact is that there are two factors in what the greenhouse signature is there. It's not only how much biomass you have, but how well you do with the technology in converting it. And Heather's estimates were that we could probably get to a carbon signature for that biofuel, which was about 80% below fossil fuel. You note on the left-hand side of that graph, she's looking at E85, and you can really never get that close to being below fossil fuel with that solution. So E85 is probably not a long-term solution, but with more sophisticated fuels, more drop-in fuels, and better technology, we could get very close. Now, the issue that I want to point out is it's very important to get that technology in place, but even if you do, we are limited by the amount of biomass. That's the fundamental limitation. And here is a plot that shows that. The red lines are the lines are for different technology development levels. So the blue is a much better technology than the red, but they all depend linearly on the amount of biomass available. Now the reason this happens is that every gallon of biofuel you produce displaces a gallon of fossil fuel. So the biomass part, the amount of biomass part gets a double whammy, and the technology only gets a single whammy. So I think that although the technology is very important, you can't get away from the limitation of how much biomass you have that way. So let me put it together. These are the historical limits, and the one on the right is the emissions, where emissions would be if we didn't take these four measures. If we only take one of them, a lot of people say, oh, well, don't use natural gas, we'll just do efficiency. Well, if you did that, you wouldn't get there. If you only do one of the measures, any single of these measures, you don't get there. The green bars are how much of the emissions are coming from fuel. The yellow is how much from electricity. And Jeff, I believe the yellow is the load balancing part, which essentially is a fuel part. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the emissions for electricity included.
Right. So basically, it's all fuel. And the red dashed line is the target. So you can't get there with any one. So anybody who says, don't bother with efficiency, we'll just do low carbon electricity. You know, it doesn't work that way. You have to do them all. And I'll quickly go through. If you do 2, you get closer. If you get 3, you get closer. And even if you do all 4, we're still at about twice the emissions that we need to get to. So this graph, I'll leave you with. It's in the. It shows the details of the 60% solution, what you've done. I won't dwell on it right now. The next question is, how do you go the rest of the way? Well, Jeff put together a list of ideas in terms of their effectiveness, which are the effectiveness of these ideas improves as you go on. So if let's say we found a way to make CCS more effective, well, that's more or less equivalent to saying all of our baseload would come from nuclear power is another way to do that. And so those are two ideas, but they're not terribly effective. If we got these next 5 ideas, if we use these in combination, it looks like we could make some real dents. So we actually solved the load balancing problem. We actually improve the technology, which is in the realm of the possible for biofuel, so that it produces no emissions. We have some behavior change. We didn't put that in until the end because we wanted to make sure we had a technology analysis, but we did put it in here. We had some very complicated processes where, that comes later. If we take biomass and burn it to make electricity, but then also sequester the emissions, we get a credit that can offset the use of continued fossil fuel in transportation. The difficulty with that is that we've never connected the transportation system credits to the electricity credits that way. So that would be a real policy requirement, or it would never happen. Yes. And hydrogen might make a difference as well. So we looked at all of these. And then we looked at some that were really potentially effective, like suppose we had all the biomass we want. But then we looked at the implication of that, and it looks very unrealistic. Possible, but difficult. And then some more complicated ideas. There's an idea that comes out of Princeton, Bob Williams, of using biomass and CCS and coal together to produce fuel and electricity all at the same time and do it very efficiently. And maybe that would work. And then finally, we looked at a few ideas, and Nate's here to tell you about the fuel from sunlight idea. It was a major project in the state of California. And Nate doesn't like me to say this, but I think that's actually the closest thing I've seen in energy to a silver bullet, if it happens. Because the real problem is fuel. If we can make it from sunlight without making emissions, then we can solve all of these problems very easily. Fusion is also under investigation in the state. And we tried to actually look at mostly those ideas that were in the state. And if fusion works, we'll have a lot of electricity. We can make fuel from electricity. And there may be other ideas. So just to give you a feeling for this, if you take the biomass and you use it to make electricity and sequester it, because that's a little bit more efficient, you end up saving a little bit more emissions than if you just use the biomass to make fuel and then burn that. So you save a little bit. It's not a huge amount. The next thing we did was look at hydrogen. And what we did is Chris Yang made an estimate of where the low-hanging fruit was on hydrogen. How much by 2050 could be easily converted? How much demand could we generate? And then we looked at making hydrogen by reforming methane and sequestering the CO2. Right? Because if you don't do that, you're not saving anything. You don't sequester the CO2 from making the hydrogen from methane, which was the only, Joan Ogden's in the room as well, and Joan felt that that was the only real feasible way to do it at this point, with maybe some ideas about doing stranded wind power, for example, but this was the really solid one. And as a result, we figured out what we thought the demand for hydrogen can be, and you can see that that shaves a bit of need for electricity off, and it shaves quite a bit from the fuel perspective. So instead of using 25 billion gallons per year, we're using 18. So the fuel, this summarizes the same information that I just gave you. But basically, we'd run all the buses on hydrogen, right? Is that was the idea? All the buses, some of the trucks, some of the cars. So another case that we looked at was doubling the biomass supply. And I think the point that I want to make here is that it would require about 62% of California's landmass to get all the biomass we wanted. So it doesn't look like a really good solution. So here, putting some of these together now, the same graph. These are the single strategies. None of them get you down below except the high biomass supply, which seems unreasonable to count on. Possible, but you might not want to count on it. And here's starting to put the strategies together. So if we do more than one of these, it's possible not only to get below the target, but to get to zero or even below zero. So the technology upside of these methods is pretty exciting. And this doesn't even count, for example, fusion or fuel from sunlight. So I'd like to just summarize the 80%. We think that the biofuels are really important, really promising, but risky to bet on them for everything. We need an alternative pathway for fuel. Hydrogen could be part of that. Fuel for sunlight. There are probably others. We need to think about it. One of the things I think is really interesting, if you look deeply into any of these, like hydrogen, CCS becomes carbon capture and storage become a part of those. And it may well be that carbon capture and storage is a more important technology for fuel in this state than it is for electricity. And that's a different perspective on CCS than people have seen. Zero emission load balancing, we coined this ZELB acronym. I probably could do better. We've tried a few. No one likes any of them. But some way of having a real focus on zero emission load balancing, I think, is an important way to think about this. And we're going to have to do more than one thing, portfolio of approaches. So we can do it. We can get below 1990 levels. And you're going to need a sustained policy, obviously. These are very aggressive targets. And the challenges, challenges for efficiency and electrification are generally not technology issues. The base load problem, if we decide how much and what base load we want, and the Fukushima effect on that is a serious problem. I mentioned load balancing. If we go with the highly renewable, if we go above 33% or even at 33%, we really have to focus on this problem. We need to get our biofuels right, need to do them right, need to get everything we can out of them, and we need something else. So, and multiple strategies, figuring out which one of those multiple strategies are the best ones to bet on is still out there, and a good challenge. Thanks. I'll stop there and have a question. So I can invite my panel members to come up and we'll take questions.
Well done.
Thank you. I feel like I can do it in my sleep, which is not good. Well, let's get it right.
We got a couple in from the internet, and we're going to get some more. So why don't you just sort them out the way you wish, and also have your esteemed colleagues answer which is appropriate. I don't know if you want to really go that way, but you might want to make a comment. I'm moving the question.
And Chris can answer that. Okay, so we're open for questions from the audience.
Questions?
We answered them all, I guess, right? Yeah, over here.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Johan Herner with the ARB. You made a pretty compelling case that nuclear might need to be part of our base load. And I'm sure that not only California has reached that conclusion. I've heard that there may not be enough uranium for the entire world to go nuclear in a significant way. Is that, first of all, is that true? And secondly, if so, is that something you've considered?
There's plenty of uranium. The question is, what does it cost to get it out? It says it's on. The latest estimate that's been done is that there's enough cheap uranium to last something between 50 and 100 years. And most of the experts say that there's plenty of uranium in the Earth's crust and in the oceans. And if you look at what's happened with rare minerals in the past, as people want to go to lower concentration ores, they always find ways to do it for the same price. And you can look at whether it's platinum or gold or silver or what the extraction cost is roughly the same. So the general belief is that this is not a problem for at least the next century and probably for much longer than that.
Any question? Question? Yeah, in back here.
Where are we at for the fusion power? Where are we at?
Where are we with fusion?
The question is what the prospects for fusion power. I can only answer it by saying one of the great fathers of fusion said practical fusion energy is 50 years in the future and will always be so. Right now, there's a big effort going on internationally. There is a fusion demonstration experiment going on in France, supported by 10 countries. They're not going to know whether that works at all until 2025 at the earliest, and you're not going to know what fusion electricity is going to cost for 10 or 20 years after that, if the pilot in France works. So it's highly uncertain, and I don't think there's anybody who would bank on fusion now. If Jane had included a category 5 in her exploration,
Is that like a
I'd put
hurricane
fusion
group?
in that.
just let me take one from the internet and then we'll go here. So this is for you, Jeff. Could you clarify your assumptions on CO2 emissions from nuclear? From your description, it seemed you assumed 0 emissions from nuclear power. In your methodology, did you account for emissions from power plant construction and fuel extraction and transport?
Yes, that's better. Yes, we did not. We assumed 0 emissions in the operation of the plant. We could have done a better job of explicitly including all of the construction and fuel extraction costs, but instead that was sort of folded up in the industrial sector generally. Some of our analyses were done at a very high level. We think overall that the emissions from constructing what is the equivalent, 30 nuclear plants is not going to blow the budget. But it's something that probably another iteration we'd like to include all of those explicitly along with the construction of the electricity system.
Right, and this is Brian Hannigan. It's important to keep in mind that what we were trying to do was outline a 2050 electric system that had a near zero, or an under 80 million metric ton rate of emissions per year. The emissions associated with the construction of any wind turbine, nuclear plant, you name it, those are one-time costs. And so if you think about, the goal of this study was how is the system on an ongoing basis going to get under the 80 per year? The one-time costs are, a payment as part of that process to get there, but they're not sort of built into in any significant way the operating budget of the energy system when it comes to carbon.
And I'll also just follow up, something else occurred to me, that the 2050 energy system is going to be much lower carbon, obviously, than today. So constructing a nuclear plant in 2050 is not going to be using the same dirty petroleum-based diesel fuels and so on as we use today.
I do want to clarify, though, that the biofuels section of the report did take all those things into account, embedded energy and indirect land use change and all the other caveats. So that was a much more conservative number for that. And I did want to correct, too, the number that Jane showed for doubling biomass does not take 62% of the land area in California. It's like 12.
Oh, it's 12. Okay.
So I'm sorry, that was a, yeah.
That's a big reduction.
Right.
I never got the corrected slide. Okay. Well, I'd still say 12% is a lot, but yeah, over here.
Steve Kafka, California Biomass Collaborative. My question isn't about biomass, however, it's about hydro. A number of scenarios for climate change indicate that there may be less snowpack, that runoff may be flashier, higher rate, all of which suggests that we'll need more storage. So did you account for increased hydroelectric power and increased storage in the future?
There's a whole set of changes that would occur because of climate change that we did not account for, that need to be factored into the analysis, when we haven't done that. So, for example, demands would change because of climate change, the amount of water available would change because of climate change, the amount of, how efficient air-cooled plants are would change because of climate change. So all of those things are factors that were not included in this round. So no, we didn't account for it. And it's an important point. Yeah, got another question from the audience, or take one from the, yeah.
Yeah, as a admittedly casual observer of this kind of thing, just trying to keep up with the paper and things like that, I was kind of surprised to see carbon sequestration as sort of a mainstream and category or way to reach that goal. Could you talk a little bit more about carbon sequestration, how sustainable it is, and how whether it's really ripe right now, which apparently it sounds like it is, or will be.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So, the process of capturing carbon from a power plant station really depends on the kind of station that you're working with. Most of the coal in this country is built around pulverized coal technologies, and so the challenge there is in reducing, as Jane mentioned, the parasitic load, the amount of energy that you have to put in to extract the CO2 from the exhaust gas. Right now that's running at about 30% in terms of an energy penalty. And what you want to do is you want to bring that down to something more in the range of 10 to 15%. There have been a couple of pilot projects in California as well as around the country and the world to try to demonstrate new solvents, new sorbents, new materials that have an affinity to pull carbon dioxide, which is present at single-digit percentage levels in the exhaust coming out of a power plant. You've got to extract this very dilute gas, concentrate it, clean it, and get it into a form that you would be comfortable with putting into the subsurface. For natural gas, that's a different chemical mix, and so there you're advantaged because there's more carbon dioxide per unit of flue gas coming out, but it comes out in a different chemical property that requires some new research, and I know the PEER program is sponsoring that, as are a number of electric utilities. And then the same can be said for biomass with CCS. That's on the capture side. And there are a number of different technologies, a lot of which show promise, but the challenge there is bringing the costs down to a point where it can compete. The storage side is a little bit more interesting in the sense that we have a few places in the world where we're injecting at sort of 1 million tons of CO2 per year or greater. In the North Sea and the deserts of Algeria are a couple of the larger projects, but those are a handful of what I would call commercial size demonstrations that would need to be conducted before we could really bank on the idea of sequestering carbon. To put it in perspective, one 500 megawatt coal station, or think of it as 1,000 megawatts of natural gas, creates on order of 4 million tons per year, and we're only right now sequestering in places at the largest end at 1 million. So we don't have kind of the operational experience with the scale of a commercial size large power station. And then to go beyond that, we've got about 60 years worth of capacity if you inject it into reservoirs that we know of. That's enough to get you to 2050, but one of the assumptions of our work was that you would be building that system to run kind of infinitely, because you have to continue on beyond 2050. So after that, you'd need to find other places to put the CO2. There's a tremendous potential for these saline aquifers that are really deep, that are not used for other water purposes. But we just haven't injected CO2 there. We don't know how it behaves, whether it reacts, how it moves, and those are all technical issues. You go beyond that into the legal and the regulatory frameworks for managing the environmental aspects and dealing with multiple stakeholders that might live above CO2 that's injected, albeit at 10 or 15,000 feet. It's kind of a brave new world for technology and also for policy in that space. It is, however, as I think Jane showed, something that's vitally important if you want to use fossil fuels, either at base load or for load balancing. The budget that we're dealing with in 2050 is so small that you've got to have CCS if you're going to use fossil fuels at all.
Yes, back here. Oh, over here. Sorry. Hi.
Bart Cruz with the Air Resources Board. Very comprehensive analysis, and I think you make a compelling case that existing technologies will get us most of the place where we want to go. I had a three-part question. First, how you dealt with non-CO2 gases, which are, I think, about 15% of the current inventory, and obviously would be a significant share of the 2050 target if they weren't controlled further. Two, if you looked at cost at all, I know the Stern report estimated maybe a 1 to 3% percentage points of GNP to meet a really aggressive target like you've looked at, and if you have any information on what you think it would cost for California. And then third, what you would recommend for policy instruments to meet these targets, whether you think it's enough to ratchet down on the cap in our market we're developing, or some other instruments are needed.
Well, first of all, this I'll let Jeff take some of this question, but I want to say we were only looking at the energy sector, so we didn't look at emissions from fertilizer and things like that. We only looked at the energy sector. We proportioned energy sector emissions down by 80%, so we didn't look at the rest of the system. We did not do an economic study. It was a technology study. We did ask and enforce that people not invoke in the analysis technologies that were considered to be wildly expensive. So, for example, using electricity to disassociate water to get hydrogen was not okay because it was just too expensive. So we also did some preliminary work at what we thought costs would look like in 2050, and other people had done work on that. We looked at that work, and the sort of first order conclusion was that the cost of different technologies that might be competing, particularly in electricity, was not a major factor. That the costs were, to first order, they were about the same, and that we wouldn't be able to do very well in predicting how those were going to change. We also asked people to look at the technologies that they were invoking and tell us how they thought they would change and why they thought they would change over time. So in particular, this is particularly important for nuclear power, which is extremely expensive now, but we asked people to say why they thought it might go down and what evidence they had it might go down. So if people thought prices were going to go down, it was because there was going to be a learning curve or there was going to be an economy of scale, and we asked people to describe that. We also asked people to identify if there were resource limitations that would cause prices to go up or competition to go up. So in the sense of economics, that's the kind of analysis that we did. It was very qualitative and based on the idea that we didn't think we could do a really good job of predicting what prices would be in 2050. In terms of the policies that we want to recommend, they have to do really with developing the policies that would enact the 4 steps. So in other words, we said you have to improve efficiency this much, and you can translate that into how much per year, how much rollover per year, how many buildings retrofit per year, to what standard. And so we are recommending policies that will take each of those steps. And in the electrification area, we're saying it's not just going to be plug-in cars, but all of the other electrification, the bus and rail, and the and heat that need to be incorporated into an electrification policy. So in a electricity policy, we're asking that you account for all the emissions from load balancing as a policy. So if you do a portfolio standard for renewable energy, it would be, and it's probably politically impossible to do a low carbon portfolio standard, but what it's really pointing to is you have to somehow have some policies that are going to deal with those renewable energies that end up producing a lot of emissions because they're firmed with natural gas. And then in terms of the fuels, we're asking for policies that would optimize the use of the biomass, the way we, to look at maximizing the amount of biomass we can get effectively without interacting with food, to put in place impetus to get technologies in place that will also be alternatives to fuel.
Jane, just a quick comment on the cost piece. So we didn't use the full sort of macro or microeconomic sets of tools that one would want to look at to deal with costs explicitly, but I think it's shared by the group. This would be an excellent follow-on opportunity to dig into each of the scenarios that Jane showed, all the different ways that the technologies could play out, and then ask how much capital expenditure would be asked and for and when, what's the ultimate value to various approaches in terms of cost to consumers, economic impacts on the state's future growth. I mean, there's a whole suite of economic questions that I think you've got a tremendous horsepower in California to look at in more detail as a follow-on.
Do you want to add something, Jeff?
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say to your first part about the non-CO2 emissions, as Jane said, we only dealt with the energy sector, but we did count the upstream emissions, including non-CO2 emissions from fuel production, both bio-based fuels and fossil-based fuels.
But we only did that on a CO2, on a pure CO2 basis, did not include NO2 and other CO2 equivalent greenhouse forcing gases as part of our study.
Well, certain things like methane emissions, lost in the transport and refining process were included, though.
Yeah, and those gases were included in the biofuel analysis.
Yeah. So let me take one from the internet here. This is to you, Chris. Your thoughts regarding the possible use of ammonia as a transportation fuel?
Oh, there you go. Ammonia was not considered as a possible transportation fuel in this analysis, and
Yeah, I don't really have much to say about ammonia.
Just one thing to flag on that. Ammonia-based compounds are currently the favored sorbents and solvents for CO2 and for the CCS purposes. And one of the more interesting pieces of work that we've been involved with at EPRI is look at what do the fugitive emissions of ammonia mean in terms of air quality. And it's an issue that if we were to go to using that for a transport fuel, we'd want to explore further. Ammonia obviously does very interesting things in the atmospheric boundary layer, so it's worth thinking about that.
And ammonia would, in principle, potentially be a good transportation fuel, but you have to make it somehow in a zero-carbon way. And so, in fact, you could view ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen, because presumably the way you get ammonia is the way we make ammonia now is the Haber-Bosch process with nitrogen and hydrogen. So you really are asking the question, would I rather as end use distribute for vehicles ammonia versus distribute directly hydrogen, but it's got to come from the hydrogen anyway. So if you don't have a clean way to make the hydrogen, then you don't have a clean way to make the ammonia. The technical downside is you have to prevent slip in the ammonia combustion into the oxides that are very difficult then to re-reduce all the way back to the ammonia. Whereas from hydrogen, there's no such thing as chemical slip because all you end up with burning it is water anyway. So from a parasitic chemical loss viewpoint, closing the cycle by burning hydrogen is inherently going to be cleaner and less prone to leakage than burning ammonia from a system viewpoint.
Okay, so I'll take one more from the web and then we'll go here. So we have, can you expand on geothermal? Should large hydro be considered? And lastly, the green cowboy David Freeman said ocean energy in the equator could provide unlimited power. Would that be bin 3 or bin 4? So I'll answer the geothermal and the hydro and then see if anybody wants to take on the ocean. Geothermal is a great renewable resource for the state because it's baseload power, and this is just really needs to get a lot more focus. I think that if you look at what the USGS did in estimating geothermal resources in the West, it was done before plate tectonics were understood. There's really a need to go back and really get traditional geothermal much more in focus and find out how many more resources we have. We have the largest geothermal plant in the world here in California, and there's plenty of good resources yet to be had. These resources were also assessed before we understood how to tap into low temperature geothermal. So it's time to go back and do more with geothermal. Hydro is probably tapped out in our view. I would leave it there. Bob, do you want to add something there?
No, I have a question.
Oh, you have a question. Okay, so let me let. And has it bin 3 or bin 4? Traditional geothermal is definitely bin 1. There's some advanced ideas for tapping into deep geothermal that are bin 4. The ubiquitous heat underground, but you need 3 things for geothermal energy. You need heat, you need fluid, and you need permeability to circulate that fluid in the heat, pick up the heat and be able to bring it back. If you don't have those things, you have to produce them underground, and at great depth that can be very difficult, so it's bin 4. We think that we did not include any more hydro. We thought the environmental concerns were such, and the number of rivers that have already been tapped were such that we wouldn't expect more there. Now, does anybody want to take the ocean? Take the ocean.
A little bit about ocean thermal. So the good news is there is indeed a lot of energy potential in the thermal gradients in the ocean. The less than good news is that the gradients are very shallow, and so entropy is not in your favor, and so you have to have a very large apparatus that usually translates into lots of dollars per joule produced that way. So most traditional, careful, economic analyses say that because the thermal gradient is so low in the oceans overall, that extraction of the energy resource would be prohibitively expensive if done at scale and not in certain sweet spots. That doesn't in principle mean there couldn't be some clever new idea on how to do it economically. It does mean that you're dealing with a very low gradient system, as if you started to build wind resources in low wind resource areas as opposed to in high peak ones, where at least you've got a wind speed to the cube in your favor first. So that's the real issue.
Bin 4. Yeah, back here.
Yes, I have a question. As a land use planner, your building efficiency chart, do you look at it as like a total rollover of housing inventory by 2050 in order to get your zero factor on existing homes, or is it all about remodeling, upgrades, whatever? Because that was a surprising note in there.
So I did that work, and we estimated using rough numbers that because there are a certain number of buildings that are demolished and rebuilt from the ground each year, that by 2050, about half of the 2050 building stock would have been built since 2010. The other half is still going to be around, and in order to reach that target that I put up there, every building that is still extant in 2050 would have had to been touched in a significant way and retrofit, with that average that's increasing with time that Jane showed on the graph. So kind of going up to maybe 20% in the first decade and eventually hitting a 60% improvement over a frozen efficiency case. The numbers are rough. We did do some bottom-up calculations, but what fraction of that technical potential could actually be implemented was very hard to determine, so we essentially had to take a wag there. But with the turnover model that I'm describing, it's very difficult, we think, to get beyond a 40% stock average improvement.
So I think the thing here is that this is why the analysis is so interesting, in that you can question whether or not, in fact, that's a too aggressive number. Well, then to meet the target, you have to take that slack up somewhere else in what was another aggressive number. You can say electrification of the light-duty fleet to the extent that we projected may also have been aggressive. But if you relax the building turnover stock constraint, you still don't meet the target unless you pick that up somewhere else in the arithmetic. See, we did the math, and it's the math that ultimately underlies the numerical power of the argument as opposed to the generalizations that, well, we can do it all with efficiency, or we can do it all with this or that. I think the other thing that does come out is that regardless of whether you pick your favorite, which we all have personally, of renewables or CCS or nuclear or whatever it is, almost certainly, as we saw in Japan, you don't want to build an energy system around one technology for robustness, which means economic security as well as just diversity of portfolio and mitigation of risk. So whether or not our numbers happen to be right at a third, or you want to push it to 20%, 50%, 70%, it essentially doesn't matter, because you still have these gaps, these two big gaps that we've identified that are just going to get a little bigger or smaller. If you go to all renewables, the load balancing becomes bigger even as a challenge. If you go to all nuclear, then other things get bigger as a challenge. So this is a reasonable starting middle ground point that brings out the gaps as well as what we can do.
I was hoping we could ask Nate to talk about the silver bullet and sort of where we stand on that.
Nice softball question.
Well, let me talk about it first in general. I think one of the messages is that there are technology gaps, and at the same time, we do have, and are blessed within our state, a tremendous powerhouse of R&D from university to national laboratories to private industry. And so part of what I would hope a policy that would come out of this is that if indeed we're going to get to this, it's not efficient or sufficient to just rely on existing technology and then hope that somebody else solves these other gap problems, that we should be investing in the intellectual capital that drives our economic growth in our state in this area in a variety of institutions in order to help us meet this goal. Now, that being said, one of the investments that's being made is that Department of Energy has an energy innovation hub, the one in the United States, in converting fuel sunlight directly into chemical fuel. Plants do this, but plants do have fundamental inefficiency problems. That's why we struggle on land use with biofuels. They're great because they exist, but if we can do it better, if we can do it more efficiently and more cost effectively, then you solve the storage problem because you have chemical fuel. You solve the load balancing problem because you can burn it like natural gas. You solve the transportation problem, and you use the biggest resource known to man, the sun, in order to get that chemical fuel. So the prize is huge. Right now, there are three things you want. We can give you any two. You want it to be cheap, robust, and efficient. Bob, you can pick any two. You want it cheap and robust? It's not efficient. You want it robust and cheap? It doesn't last, it's 2 out of 3.
The sunlight's cheap.
The sunlight's free, but the capital to capture it's not. So that's the goal of our Energy Innovation Hub, is to go for the trifecta. And we are now staffing that up. There's a joint effort. There is a building being built at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. There's a building being built at my home campus, the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. I'm actually the director of what will be 200 people in both of these buildings that are standing up an operation to try to use modern nanoscience and the tools we have. We know we can do it. We know we can do it in a way that's efficient. We know we can do it in a way that lasts. We have to put the pieces all together into the same place at the same time in order to demonstrate a proof of concept that I can hold up to you and say, this works, and now we're going to make it cheaper, faster, better next year, and next year, and next year. So that's what we're standing up. I'm happy to tell you more details about it, but it is a very exciting thing that I think is an example of one of the things that our state should be doing, because after all, we are the state that has this goal on the books. And so to enable us to get there, we should be helping exploit our inherent skills and talents.
I want to add a comment to Nate's. One of the things, remember, in this report is we want to do this by 2050. People should look seriously about how you're going to turn the entire energy economy of the state upside down. You cannot do that overnight. Nate's program is terrific, and if it works, it will fill a gap. But if it works, you're not going to see this deployed at large scale for quite a few decades. And you should also be thinking that we're going to have to go on in this climate change problem beyond the 80% reduction. We're going to have to go on further. The real point in the study, which I think Jane has described, is we took what you know you can start on now, not even what we're absolutely certain will work now, but what you can start on now. And I think that the advanced systems like Nate's, like others, are the things that we hope are going to come in later on. But please don't decide we're going to sit until somebody starts pouring the silver into the mold to make that building.
A question over here, I think.
Yes, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a citizen, and the 10% behavioral change, I think, could cause a political meltdown that exceeds all the energy problems that you're talking about. But I have two main questions. One is, Jane, you mentioned the fair share, that California did not want to get its fair share, but we sit right next to Nevada, which only has a population of 3 million people and a lot of sun and dirt. Sounds solar to me, but and then the second thing is that
you're talking to an ex-Nevada citizen.
Oh, okay. So you can address Nevada. And then the other thing is, I'm a teacher of the deaf, and even 30 years ago, they were telling us these little teeny tiny batteries were not to be put in the garbage because they would pollute the environment. And we're talking about all these carbon emissions, but the battery thing is hanging around in my head, and these little curly cube bulbs have this thing on it that says, don't throw this in the garbage. All my friends do, but because they have mercury, so they're polluting the environment, and those little teeny tiny batteries are polluting the environment. So we're helping carbon emissions, but what about all this storage of wind and all these other deals that require storage? So I'm concerned about the other pollution that you're creating.
Yeah, there's, all of these choices, and let's just look at the electricity choice, because I think that's a good one, a good place, because we really have to make these choices. You know, how much base load do we need? Where are we going to get that base load? And if we're going to use a lot of renewable energy, then what does it mean for load balancing? And some of that load balancing is going to come from batteries, your point. Assessing not only the economic differences between those choices, but the other impacts, the other environmental impacts, is something that really needs to be done. And we have not done that. That needs to be done. It's a really good point. What do you want to know about Nevada?
You said you made the statement in your talk that we wouldn't get more than our fair share, but Nevada's right next door. Did you get?
Well, we assume, you know, California imports electricity now. I think about 15% of our electricity now, and our analysis is not really dependent necessarily on where this stuff comes from. So, you know, some of the renewable energy could come from Nevada, it could come from here. It doesn't really matter. We were kind of independent of that, but our point was, the point we did make is that and we enforced in the study, was that if you imported it, you had to import it under the same conditions that would be required to produce in California, which is currently California law anyway. You know, you can't make a long-term power purchase agreement for power from Nevada that doesn't meet California standards. So we assume that would continue. So we have nothing against imports, and we didn't really make any definitive analysis geographically about where all of this would come from. But we did ensure that it came in without what we call leakage. So we didn't allow coal-fired electricity from Wyoming to come to California unless you had carbon sequestration in Wyoming. Yeah.
And I did just want to make two follow-up points to that. So in terms of the biomass resource, however, our definition of fair share was, you know, no more than California's population share of the country's resource, which is about 1/8. And that turned out to be, I think, on the high end, Heather, what we assessed California had. So in other words, we couldn't import more biomass from other parts of the country. We could do it internationally, of course, but then we had to be careful since that number is so difficult to determine, you know, precisely. We just had some rough estimates there. What was the other thing I was going to say? If I remember, I'll bring it up again.
Let's get another question here.
Yeah, I'll just make one more comment on that. I think this is one area that I feel maybe a little more optimistic than the committee decided to feel. I actually think there will be a lot more biomass available than what's been shown, and that those imports could be high. But it does take a further analysis to really delve into that. And if you look at, you know, countries like Brazil that are really looking to expand their operations, there could be quite a volume of fuel available. But again, we want to make sure that we're upholding our standards for kind of the trifecta for sustainability, both you know, economic, environmental, and social, and we implement some certification standards or some things associated with those imported fuels.
I remembered the last thing I wanted to say very quickly. UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley Lab, where I am, are going to be soon coming up with a study that looked across the entire western U.S. integrated utility grid in order to look at the resources for, you know, for low carbon solutions similar to what was done here.
Do you need to, what's your timing for wrapping up? Okay, okay.
It's good to know that technology will help us solve this problem. Technology creates jobs, creates investment, but somehow also creates pollution. There is one technology that is always forgotten. It's called conservation. The problem is it's not creating job. Why conservation is always last in our approach in dealing with energy?
If by conservation you mean behavior change as opposed to efficiency. Yeah, which one do you mean, efficiency or behavior change? Okay.
Conservation is usually behavior change.
Right. So in other words, doing changing your habits in order to use less energy rather than using the same amount of service but in a more efficient manner. So it's a tough one because we did not want to convolute efforts to make the system more efficient with things that required people to change their habits. We did look at that, the potential for that. It's difficult to estimate. We surveyed the literature and found that across a wide range of studies, researchers sort of ballparked it at between sort of a few percent to maybe up to 20% of energy could be conserved if there was wide-scale change of behavior. But the problem is that this has to be voluntary, and it has to be organized, and so it's sort of a difficult problem to implement. Whereas you can legislate that a power plant has to be built in a more efficient manner and make that happen in one or a few locations, versus changing the habits of tens of millions of people is just inherently more challenging that way.
Just to say, SB 375 really probably looks exactly at that, because if you look at where we said emissions were coming from in 2050, after we've done all this technology that we know about, one of the nice things about the methodology that we used, as Jeff said, not convolving it from the beginning, is that you see that all these remaining emissions are coming from fuel, and most of that fuel is going into transportation. So if you want to focus on behavior change and conservation, the place that you really have to focus on if you want to affect emissions is transportation, and that jives very well with what the state is doing on SB 375.
And Jane, one final point that I think is very important to stress as we wind up. Energy efficiency, be it technology, be it demand response, be it conservation, is an absolute fundamental to make any of the other things that we've talked about on the supply side even possible from a relevant standpoint. If you're not doing the kinds of turnover in the building stock that Jeff talked about, or the kinds of turnover in the transportation fleet that Chris talked about, there is no way you can generate enough power or fuel to satisfy the needs of the economy in 2050 and meet the carbon target. You can't even get to 60%. And that was a big part of our work, was around stress testing and saying, what if you did it without efficiency? And a lot of the electricity work that I did, it basically fell apart once you got to that kind of a scale, without 80, 90% reductions in emissions or energy unit intensity between now and 2050. So, if there's one thing to come out of our study, I think it's first do energy efficiency, and then everything else becomes possible.
I mean, we're talking now with these very extreme efficiency measures having to double electricity and decarbonize it at the same time. And remember that 20, 40 years from now, pretty much everything we have in place right now will be gone, right? So we're really talking about building from scratch twice the size of the electricity system we have now and decarbonizing at the same time. If you don't do those efficiency measures, it's 3 times. It's just not a possible lift. And that's the beauty of the 4 steps. So we had the 10-step process, we have the 4-step process. Good, thank you all very much.
I'd like to just thank our panel one last time. I've personally had the distinct privilege of working with many of the panelists, if not all of them, at some stage in my previous careers at UC Davis and CCSD, and it's great to see their great ongoing work. I'll just put one more plug for the peer program, like Commissioner Boyd mentioned. I think one of the real distinct outcomes of this and results of this and messaging points of this is in California, where we are the research center really of the world and where we are the innovation center really of the world. As we try to tackle these enormous problems, the least we can do is to support it at the state level and to support ongoing research. One final thing, and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Boyd for some last thoughts. Well, I heard a talk last night, a very interesting talk last night in the context of transportation energy use in electric vehicles. And one of the points that was mentioned was that some good news is that we currently use energy incredibly inefficiently. So, whether that's good news or bad news, there's certainly a lot of opportunity there, which hopefully the private sector can, as well as the public sector, can push, but can also incentivize through some profit motivation and continued innovation. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Jim Boyd for the last words.
Thanks. I'll be real quick. A couple of comments as a policy person. Efficiency is job one in California, has been for decades. Before the electricity crisis, certainly California is rather famous for its efficiency programs, which foreclosed the idea of building hundreds of power plants in California a long time ago. And it certainly remains job one to this day. Conservation, the people of California during the electricity crisis showed they could do it, but it's easy to forget it and let it slip away. Affecting public behavior, land use, VMT reduction, all of that has been the broken, if not wobbly, third leg of our energy stool for a long, long time. And SB 375 was referenced, and it kind of begins to open the door. And I think the future of California is highly dependent upon that becoming a very dominant thing, but it'll take time. I want to thank all of the panel, and I want to thank all of you for being here. This message needs to be conveyed to audiences hundreds of times the size of this audience, but you're pioneers. Thank you for being here. We bureaucrats have a difficult time convincing lots of other policymakers of the need to do things. Scientists, academics are among the last of the respected citizens of the state, and so I thank you all for the work you've made. It's up to you to carry the message further. It's up to a lot of us, though, to pick up that message and work with it, or to talk to skeptics about, please deal with the academic and scientific community for the right answers to these issues if you won't take it from us who thought we made our living out of trying to do these kinds of things. So in any event, I thank you for being here today. I thank all of you for being here. A lot more work has to be done in this arena. It's really exciting. It's kept me going for many years. I almost wish it'd keep me going longer. But we have decades of work to do, as just indicated. To keep California as it was, I always shudder to think about an article I read by one of my most respected friends, A. Allen Post, the Legianus, a long time ago, an article about the late, great Golden State. I think a lot of us still try to barely hang on to keeping it the Golden State, which means you've got to be progressive, aggressive, and different. Good luck to all of us. Again, thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, Jen. As you know, we're going to go to the next room for the afternoon session.
Oh, okay. And we have a lunch meeting somewhere.
Right, but we'll see you next door. All right. Okay.
Everybody, your chair.
Oh, sure.